Let me begin by introducing our first speaker. And our first speaker is Salim Vally. So Salim is the director of the Center for Education Rights and Transformation and associate professor at the Faculty of Education at the University of Johannesburg. Salim was involved in a campaign that convinced the University of Johannesburg, UJ, to sever its institutional ties from Ben Gurion University. UJ was the first institution to officially sever relations with an Israeli university. And I think we should all raise a hand to this huge achievement by faculty and by students. Salim was a leading member of the South African students' movement in 1976-77, and he left the country after its banning by the erstwhile apartheid regime and after severe repression. He returned to South Africa in 1982. From 1985 to 1984, he was the education officer for CCAWUSA, later SACAWU, and was a founder member of the Congress of South African Trade Union, COSATU. Salim was an activist for Palestinian solidarity since the days of apartheid in South Africa. And after the first democratic elections in 1994, he campaigned for the boycott of Israel and with others founded the Palestine Solidarity Committee. In 2001, he was a leading member of social movements and trade unions that organized the 10,000-strong march at the UN World Conference Against Racism, which marched behind a banner that read, "Zionism is racism," and pledged to form the second anti-apartheid movement against apartheid Israel. He taught at York University between 2007 and 2009, and during that time he was a member of Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid, KAYA, and also a founding member of Faculty for Palestine, and also did a million talks around Ontario and probably all over the country. So in 2010, together with student organizations, trade unions, and academics, convinced the University of Johannesburg to break links established during the days of apartheid with Ben Gurion University. Salim was prevented last year by the apartheid authorities in Israel from delivering a keynote address on education at Birzeit University in occupied Palestine. Salim will speak about the importance of the academic boycott, in particular the academic boycott work that is being done in South Africa. Please welcome Salim.
I just want to start with the way we normally start. Mass meetings, this qualifies actually as a mass meeting. Although these days, as John Saul will tell you, after listening to the General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers, who was here the other day, who leads an organization of 320,000 workers, that the idea of mass meetings has taken on new dimensions. But we normally start with saying power to the people. Power is ours. Amandla.
Amandla.
Amandla. Amandla. Almost 10 years ago, the world lost one of its most erudite and passionate intellectuals. And for most of his life, Edward Said relentlessly focused his prodigious intellect in support of not only the oppressed people of Palestine, but beyond. And his writings today, I told a number of students and academics in the universities in England, remain a font of wisdom for those of us who believe, despite the corporatized debasement of higher education, which casts the public space as a commodified sphere, that intellectual work must recover its connections with political realities. And these include issues of solidarity and our responsibility as students, as academics, to being citizens in the broader world beyond the confines of the academy. Now, a consistent theme and preoccupation of Edward Said was what it means to be an intellectual and the role of the public intellectual. In both his seminal books, Orientalism and culture and imperialism, he exposes the political consequences of studies that masquerade as conforming to the canons of academic neutrality, and in his words, the pernicious corruption of academic activity that is not aligned with the victims of injustice. Now, Said grappled with ways in which it might be possible for intellectuals to promote the causes of democracy, of social justice, without being co-opted by the structures of power. He was convinced that intellectuals can make a difference in challenging injustices and opening up transformative possibilities. For Said, crucially, the power of resistance is situated in the ability of the intellectual to what he called to write back to imperial power and hegemony. He borrowed and adapted a musical term, contrapunctual, to denote this counterpoint to imperial hegemony and oppression. And for me, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement does precisely that, but it goes beyond writing back. It is concerned with contrapunctual praxis. And in this sense, the words of Arundhati Roy comes to mind. It's not just about speaking truth to power, it's about speaking truth about power. It is not just about those who are voiceless, because she says people do have a voice, but that voice is silenced or it's preferably not heard. And in this sense, the BDS campaign and the boycott movement against the erstwhile apartheid regime is really a movement of colonized people writing back, involved in this praxis. And for many of us, the BDS builds on the most potent weapon we have learned to rely on, forged and steeled in the numerous struggles of workers and oppressed throughout time and space, and that is solidarity. Not the impotent posturing and strutting around of politicians and elites, and the trickery of endless and fruitless rounds of negotiations aimed really at encouraging passivity, but rather solidarity that has served the oppressed and working class struggles around the world so well. And there were moments in modern history when particular struggles galvanized millions around the world, including academics and intellectuals, to act in solidarity with oppressed people elsewhere. And so this occurred, for example, during the Spanish Civil War, the struggle of the Vietnamese against the French and US imperialism, and of course in the support of the liberation struggles of the people of Southern Africa. And today, after one outrage after another, daily injustices piled upon massacres and atrocities, support for Palestinian human rights has become the emblematic solidarity movement of our time. There are many salient things we can compare apartheid Israel to with apartheid South Africa. Of course, both were settler colonial formations formed by Europeans obsessed with the Old Testament under the thumb of British imperialism, and each launched their particularly racist state fortuitously in 1948. And this was recognized, in 1961. The South African Prime Minister at that time, we called him the architect of apartheid, Hendrik Verwoerd, and he said with a degree of candor without bothering about liberal opinion, that Zionists took Israel, he meant Palestine, from the Arabs after the Arabs lived there for 1,000 years. And this is what Hendrik van Roodt said. In that I agree with them. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. And of course, for many of us who were in the trenches in 1976, we'll never forget that that was the year that John Foster was invited by Yitzhak Rabin and Perez to visit Israel, and he was feted and hosted by them. The same John Foster, who was a member of the Ossever Brandwacht, a pro-Nazi organization during the Second World War. So many South Africans, in addition to identifying with the struggle of Palestinians, also recognized that Israel was playing a role in their own oppression. For instance, Israel was an important arms supplier to apartheid South Africa, despite the international arms embargo. And by 1980, 35% of Israel's arms exports were destined for South Africa. Israel was loyal to the racist state and clung on to the friendship when almost all other relationships with other countries dissolved. And during the 1970s, this affiliation extended into the field of nuclear weaponry, when Israeli experts helped South Africa develop at least 6 nuclear weapons. And there's a wonderful book by Sasha Sorensky called The Secret Alliance, which documents this alliance and the development of nuclear weapons, including by professors who were in my university. It was called RAU at that time, Randse Afrikaanse Universiteit. And in the 1980s, when the global anti-apartheid movement, including some people who are present here, forced many states to impose sanctions on the apartheid regime, Israel imported South African goods and re-exported them to the world as a form of inter-racist solidarity. So when the 10,000 people marched at the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, saying that it's the beginning of a second anti-apartheid movement, they were led by people like the late Dennis Brutus and Fatima Mir. Behind that banner, Zionism is racism. It was something we felt very dearly. 4 years later, as many of you know, 170 organizations in 2005, Palestinian organizations, called for the Worldwide BDS Campaign, similar to the one launched against apartheid South Africa, around 3 basic points. These points are modest. They're not very radical. They're in line with international law and human rights law. One is the right of return of those people displaced by the 1948 ethnic cleansing. Secondly, the end of the illegal occupation of Palestinian territories. And 3, the end of the discrimination of Palestinians living in Israel. There's another reason why we feel that the Palestinian struggle does not just exert a visceral tug on many of us around the world. A reading of imperialism shows that apartheid Israel is needed as a fundamentalist and militarized warrior state, not only to quell the Palestinians, but as a rapid response, font of reaction in concert with the despotic Arab regimes to do the empire's bidding in the Middle East and beyond. And I have a wonderful booklet, I don't have the time to go through it, by the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, called Israel's Worldwide Role in Repression, and it documents Israel's supports for the military dictatorships in Central and South America and in many other countries as well. As Naomi Klein has written, Jason has talked about, is that Israel has successfully marketed its status as an armed fortress in a state of continuous war to export its expertise in security, counterterrorism, and surveillance, the drone technology, for example, while field testing its weapons and instruments of state control on Palestinians. Many of us know about white phosphorus, but also how Palestinians are constantly under surveillance and how they are controlled all the time. And internationally, Israel sells itself as a model for other countries, helping to normalize perpetual war and promote a repressive security state within the larger global order. So it differs from the myriad numbers of petty dictatorships around the world that defenders of Israel would prefer focusing attention on, because it does not just visit repression directly upon the people that it rules, but it's a high-profile exporter of state terror. Many of us are confronted with, but there are differences between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. Absolutely there are. Many of us prefer to say that what we have in Israel is an apartheid-like system. There is a family resemblance. Some call it apartheid of a special type. But if you're looking for a legal definition, we have one. In 1973, the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid was unanimously agreed upon and enacted from 1976. We also have the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And these two conventions, taken together, gives us a definition of apartheid as a set of policies and practices of legal discrimination, political exclusion, social marginalization based on racial, national, and ethnic origins. Now, this definition obviously draws on what Ron Greenstein has called historical apartheid, South African apartheid, but it's not limited to it. The conventions talk about apartheid in a generic sense, and the focus of attention should be on the actual practices of the state and the extent to which they are exclusionary or discriminatory, rather than on the degree of similarity to or difference from the historical case of apartheid South Africa. Ron makes an important point. He says, for example, whether the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is really a Bantustan is not in itself an interesting question. Whether it practices pseudo-independent rule that disguises the effective control by Israel should be the real focus of concern. We should be interested in the substance of political arrangements rather than any possible convenient labels. And Zionism tried for a very long time to weave an amazing web of deception to conceal its racism and evade the linkage with South African apartheid. But this is no longer possible, even for those who are suitably disposed to this. The labyrinthine legalisms that were devised once upon a time have been exposed for what they are today. Initially, there was pretense to disguise state racism. Today, there isn't. People like Yuri Davis, who wrote a book on Israeli apartheid, meticulously talked about all these legalisms. Lately, Ben White has written another book. But a few weeks ago, someone by the name of Shulamit Aloni, who used to be a member of the Knesset, an MK, and former education minister, liberal education minister in the Israeli Knesset, died. But she wrote an incredible, she died about 2 weeks ago, she wrote an incredible essay where she documented a trip she took on one of these bypass roads. It was a Jewish-only road, and the soldiers stopped a car and threatened to arrest the driver and impound the car, and she was outraged and she told the soldier, "What are you trying to do?" And he said, "What do you want me to do? This is a Jewish-only road. Shall I put up a sign saying for Jews only in order for people to say this is apartheid?" Today, that kind of pretense is no longer done. We've had a number of studies in South Africa. The Human Sciences Research Council in 2009 put together a 300-page document after 15 months of work. It was prompted by John Dugard's role as the eminent jurist John Dugard was also the special rapporteur. And this documents why it qualifies to be called apartheid using international law. More recently, we had the Russell Tribunal. The members of the jury included Stefan Hessel, a co-author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a survivor of the concentration camp who died not too long ago. People like Alice Walker, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and others who also heard testimony and came to the same conclusion. I was meant to talk about the boycott campaign at our university against Ben Gurion. I think the chair is being quite generous. I think I'm running out of time. But if I can just quickly say that in 2009, the University of Johannesburg resuscitated an apartheid-era agreement with Ben Gurion. I just told you that Sasha Suransky talked about how the university that was Rao, which is now UJ, had this arrangement. So this attempt really angered many colleagues of mine, the student group, the SRC, the trade union movement, and we banded together and we started over a period of 18 months. We started talking about issues of academic boycott. And the whole question of academic freedom featured prominently in the whole imbroglio, centered on the issue of academic freedom. And we made the point that academic freedom in the case of violent occupation, of apartheid, of genocide, and gross human rights abuse must surely bear reference to those very conditions for its criteria of determination. And we argued that failure to recognize that would mean that the very concept of freedom more generally, and academic freedom in particular, becomes both meaningless and bereft of any practical possibilities. We also pointed out that the basic rights of Palestinians, explained in numerous reports, including UNESCO reports, clearly showed that academic freedom does not exist for the vast majority of Palestinian academics. Pertinent too is the fact that unlike other countries where human rights abuses exist, Israel, in fact, is not sanctioned. And this is, when people say, why is Israel being singled out by us? And this is one of the reasons. Other countries have sanctions against them. Israel, in fact, by the EU, by the US, by Canada, is pampered and is privileged by the West instead of being sanctioned, despite all these countless violations of international law and conventions. Unlike many countries where human rights abuses exist, an overwhelming number of Palestinians, the real victims, including a significant group amongst Israeli academics, have called for the isolation of the Israeli state and its institution. And when I was in England, I had the privilege of meeting people in Boycott, the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine, who have been campaigning for an academic boycott against Israel. And Professor Hilary Rose, sorry, not Clinton, it comes out too easily from, definitely not Hillary Clinton. Professor Hilary Rose, perhaps the BDS campaign is really working. Hilary Rose is a sociologist of science, and she reminds us very significantly of academics, including liberal and left geneticists who actively collaborated with their German counterparts, who provided the scientific basis for this really ugly concept which the Nazis used, called lives not worth living, or Rassenhygiene. And Hilary Rose says, here an absolutist principle of academic freedom facilitated the eugenic project of the final solution. And it's really instructive that both Hilary and Stephen are members of Boycott. And Palestinian academics, through PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, speak to the very many ways in which Israeli academic institutions scientifically collude with occupation, ethnic cleansing, and racism in practical terms, whether it is through engineering, geography, demography, hydrology, or psychology, amongst many other disciplines. There is a wonderful booklet by Yuri Jacobi Keller. It's called The Economy of the Occupation, and it's about the academic boycott of Israel, and it carefully goes through each of the universities and how they are complicit with the military occupation of Palestinians. When we started with the boycott, Amnesty International released a report called Troubled Waters, Thirsting for Justice, Palestinians' Access to Water Restricted. And it detailed meticulously Israel's discriminatory water policies. I don't have the time to go through those water policies, but just to say, in a place like the Gaza Strip, where 90 to 95% of the water from its only water source, the coastal aquifer, is contaminated, Israel's medieval siege of Gaza has prevented the import of basic building materials, spare parts, and energy for the treatment of wastewater. And so chemicals necessary for desalinating the brackish water are prohibited by Israel. And these restrictions are compounded by Israel's frequent bombings of the only power plant that exists there. But it goes further than that. It also kidnapped the chief engineer of this power plant from a Ukrainian train many years ago, before what's happening there now. Dirar Abu Sisi, he was actually kidnapped from this train in 2010, February, while on his way to visit his Ukrainian wife and children, and put into a prison. So after a lot of detailed investigation, reports, the decision to sever links with Ben Gurion University was not an impulsive one. It was a result of a secret ballot voted by an overwhelming majority of Senate members after numerous committees, task teams, fact-finding missions, lengthy council, and Senate deliberation. Many of these academics were in row in the past, and this gave us tremendous hope. In the beginning we thought, these are conservative academics, there's no way they're going to support us. But just the strength of the campaign, the force of our arguments, Israeli and Palestinian academics coming to visit us, discussing this with us, and the overwhelming support of the workers of the university and the students, as well as leading intellectuals in South Africa, we won this debate. And for us, in an age of the neoliberal knowledge economy, where there's mere rhetorical support for social justice, and where research and teaching related to this purpose, to social justice, is seen as ornamental, and where lucre trumps solidarity under neoliberalism, we really felt that this was a significant victory and can be replicated elsewhere. I've seen in England victory after victory. And of course, Amilcar Cabral teaches us not to claim easy victories, but many of these victories are through hard work. Campaigns against G4S, which runs some of the prisons in Palestine, including prisons for children, links with Israeli universities, that is increasing in momentum. So it's very clear to us that it is possible. What we need to do is, as Joel Covell so eloquently put it, is to place Israel where it belongs, in the company of apartheid South Africa, and deprive it first of its cloak of normalcy, and then of the capital flows, which are its lifeblood. The massive Israeli apparatus is there to protect a very shaky foundation, and their bare conscience is strong but brittle. A central goal of organized Zionism is to block academic, cultural, and economic boycotts, including through their Hasbara machinery. To the degree that these succeed, they have the potential of tipping Israel into the same category as its unlamented apartheid friend. Once this identification happens, matters can go downhill for the Zionist state very rapidly. And in the last minute I have, all I can say is that the Palestinian cause is first and foremost the set of injustices that those people have suffered and continue to suffer, but it also represents a constant and unwavering will to resist, already written in the historic memory of the human condition. A will to resist that is born of the most profound love for humanity. And in the words of Mahmoud Darwish, to show that the tide is turning, and we take succor from those words, he says, here on the slopes of the hill, facing the dusk and the cannon of time, we do what political prisoners do and the jobless do. We cultivate hope. Thank you.